Good afternoon and greetings from St. Louis, Missouri. My name is Will Wisner and I'm a member of the Board of Directors serving the BP360 Veterans Organization. I'm also a very recent patient of Dr. Carol Hendricks. I happen to also be a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom and I deployed with the 3rd Infantry Division in March of 2007. I spent the majority of my 15-month deployment to Iraq living inside of Combat Outpost Cache, which was located among the ruins of Saddam's nuclear facility at Al Tawaitha. I experienced both kinetic and toxic exposure injuries while I was deployed, and I've been unsuccessfully attempting to deal with these injuries ever since. And by the time I found my way to Arizona, some 14 years after deployment, my cognitive health had seriously declined, and the amount of toxins inside of me were taking an extreme toll on my body. Dr. Hendricks saved my life, and I am forever grateful to her and her wonderful staff at North Star Hyperbaric and Neurology. My story of wartime exposures is unfortunately all too common. And sadly, there are not enough Dr. Hendrickses out there to pick up the slack of the Veterans Administration, who refuses to engage this issue in any meaningful way. Now, we estimate over 2.5 million veterans were exposed to toxic materials, especially by way of military burn pits, and so we've been working on this issue for well over a decade now. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about our experience with advocating on this issue and how the political games involved in the legislative process, and even after successful passage into law, has kept so many veterans from accessing benefits in healthcare as they deal with the consequences of their wartime experience. We should probably start with an explanation of what a military burn pit is. Military encampments overseas generate a tremendous amount of garbage every day. The larger forward operating bases were home to over 10,000 servicemen and women at any given time. If you think about how much trash is generated in a small town of 10,000 individuals, you can quickly start to form a mental image of the scope and scale of the problem that the military faced with the question of how do we get rid of all of this trash. Now, it's important to know that the days of military cooks serving powdered eggs and chipped beef on toast to your military-issued mess kit are long gone. So now we bring in cheap labor from other nations whose populations are willing to travel to a war zone to find work, and they serve up 3 square meals a day on little cardboard trays with little plastic packets of plastic forks and knives. Toss on the paper wrappers and plastic bags from services available in a war zone, such as iconic American staples like Subway, Pizza Hut, and Burger King, and you've got quite a lot of garbage being generated daily. Don't forget the other materials that needed disposed of in a war zone like animal or human body parts and other medical waste, or the wreckage of vehicles destroyed in roadside bombings. Now, these little military towns on the other side of the globe are cranking out a lot of trash. The military solution to get rid of all of these problems was to dig a hole in the ground, some as big as 11 acres in size, if you can imagine that, and throw all this trash into it, douse it down with jet fuel, and then light it on fire. Now, the kicker to this story is not shocking if you are in any way familiar with the term military intelligence. Somebody somewhere decided it would be a good idea to put these massive pits right alongside where these service members were sleeping. The good news is that the Veterans Administration tells us that there is no evidence to suggest that exposure to any of these columns of thick, black, inky, toxic smoke is in any way connected to the vast number of unusual illnesses, such as rare cancers and neurological conditions. Of course, I say this sarcastically, but that is the position of the government that we are attempting to change. Our executive director, Rosie Torres, along with her husband, retired U.S. Army Reserve Captain Leroy Torres, founded BP360 after Leroy returned from the war, only to face a system of delay and deny tactics. Through their journey of searching for answers, they met with an online community of other families that were facing the same injustices, and they decided that the only solution was to take this issue to the steps of the United States Congress. Now, during these initial days of advocacy work, BP360 created an independent health registry for veterans, active service members, and survivors to self-report health concerns or deaths. We quickly realized that we were up against 2 of the most powerful governmental agencies, the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense. We knew they would never track these issues, and if they did, they would always control the data. This led to Congress stepping in and passing the National VA-DoD Burn Pit Registry, signed into law in 2013. So unfortunately, this registry was built to fail, and according to the National Institute of Health that was mandated by Congress to perform periodic reviews of this program, the registry served no scientific purpose. The data collected were merely anecdotal in nature, making it worthless for research and study. Other confounding factors were baked into the program after the bill's passage by the administrators of the program, who essentially have the ability to create regulation out of thin air, and it carries the same weight as the force of law. For instance, tracking mortality data is not a priority for the VA or the DoD. If you were the survivor of a service member that died as a result of their injuries, you were not allowed to provide your loved one's information into the system. Also, if you are the survivor of someone who had registered themselves before their death, you're not allowed to update their record. We now had a situation where someone who realizes they are sick and cannot find help within the VA, as they deny there's any association between their illness and their exposure, they turn to their elected representative, who in turn has their staffers look into how best to help the veteran. The staffer will dutifully report back to their boss that, hey, good news, the VA is conducting research through the DOD Burn Pit Registry. All they need to do is sign up, provide their information, and wait for the VA to get back to them with a solution. So as the VA was looking to work out the bugs of the registry program, I had started to work for another nonprofit called the Sergeant Thomas Joseph Sullivan Center in Washington, D.C. This nonprofit was founded by the parents of a Marine Corps veteran that had suffered from massive organ failure as a result of his exposure illnesses. The VA refused to listen to Sergeant Sullivan's complaints and symptoms, and instead diagnosed him with a conversion disorder, and they prescribed watercolor painting therapy. The Sergeant Sullivan Center was a full-fledged ally and partner of Burn Pits 360, and together we walked the halls of Congress and we knocked on the doors of all the various veteran service organizations looking for reinforcements. No matter the political affiliation of the elected representatives we approached, the result was always the same. They told us that unfortunately, the issue of burn pits and toxic exposures just wasn't part of the public consciousness, and until the time came that that was no longer the case, there just wasn't enough political cover to engage the issue, as it would be an expensive one. We were told to go out and build systemic momentum. We needed to bring mass public awareness to this issue and bring other veteran service organizations on board to help get legislation drafted. The veteran service organizations told us basically the same thing. Not enough people knew about this issue, and so it would not be worth the time or money to make it an organizational priority for them. They said maybe someday that would change, but for the time being, there just wasn't enough awareness among their constituents to warrant that kind of expenditure of resources. The media was also not interested, although they were much more upfront about it, saying, if it bleeds, it leads, and your issue just simply isn't sexy enough. At this point, I would like to talk a little bit about veteran suicide and the role that it's played in this issue. Unfortunately, it's been a very large part of the overall situation, but it has not been a large part of the conversation surrounding. You see, when it comes to the toxic exposure of veterans, the VA's playbook seems to have been to look for a diagnosis in the psychological realm, and then to get the veteran on medication and out the VA's door as fast as possible. It doesn't take long for the service member's primary care provider to adjust the medication enough times that flags go up warning that they may just be a pill seeker. It also doesn't take long for the continued health to decline and to result in a loss of their job, and often the veteran, along with the spouse and children, are forced to rely on the support of family to help keep them off the streets. Now keep in mind, this is all happening while the VA is telling the veteran and their family that all this is simply in their head. As the pressure builds, it's not uncommon for couples to divorce, and soon after, suicide seems to become a very reasonable solution. This pattern of despair and tragedy became our primary talking point with elected officials as we continue to try to get them engaged. In 2015, Congress passed the Clay Hunt Act, which supercharged the VA's budget for mental health issues. It also provided an even greater incentive to shove even more veterans into this one-size-fits-all box to explain away these mysterious illnesses that the VA refused to acknowledge. In the 6 years since the passage of the Clay Hunt Act, other avenues of relief have been attempted through both the legislative process as well as the legal process. The Supreme Court has weighed in on the issue by stating that the courts cannot get involved in this issue as it's a matter of military contractors carrying out the needs of the military, which made the initial exposure problem a matter of military strategy, and it is not the role of the courts to dictate strategy to the military. There have been several attempts at starting legislation, but it hasn't been until the entrance of comedian Jon Stewart and former New York City firefighter and director of the Feel Good Foundation, Mr. John Feel, that we've seen any forward momentum. With this celebrity star power, the veteran service organizations finally saw the avenue to make the issue worthwhile for them to engage. Unfortunately, this has produced a flurry of different bills in both houses of Congress, all designed to allow for negotiation as they cut portions of the various bills and combine other portions until they arrive at something that is acceptable to all agencies involved, which is not a good thing for the veterans, by the way. These cost little to nothing, they do even less, but they allow everyone to report back to their constituents that their efforts have saved the day and untold lives of veterans moving forward. So this brings us to where we are. I'm here to tell you that it is the pressure brought by John and John through the power of media coverage that is forcing continued acceptance of the vital parts of the bill that the politicians are so eager to remove, namely those parts that actually do anything that result in benefits in health care. We'd be more than happy to expand on any of this during the question and answer session. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention. I know the video presentation format is not the most exciting, and I would love to have been there with you today in person, but honestly, I just left Tucson with a new lease on life, and it's time for me to get back to my job and family, so thank you for your understanding. Take care.